Hear now a reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 32, verses 22 through 31. And as I read these words, would you listen for a good word from the Lord? The same night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of a joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, limping because of his lip. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. When I was growing up, my favorite sport to play was basketball. I got my height really early when I was younger, so I was usually the tallest one on the team, at least on the church league basketball, and then by the time I got to middle school, but you can see what happened once I got to high school. Nobody wants a 5'11" power forward. Everyone had passed me. They kept growing, and I had stayed still. And so I should have learned probably to stick with another sport, maybe baseball. Maybe I could have learned cross country and run as fast and as far as I could. Or maybe if we had stayed in Aiken instead of moving to Atlanta where golf was affordable, I could have been one of the world's greatest golfers. I don't know, but when I was a boy, I loved basketball. And my dad loved the fact that I loved basketball. And if no other reason, it was not really his sport necessarily, but he saw it as an opportunity for a teaching moment. I remember a Christmas when they got me a basketball goal for our yard, right outside our driveway. I remember working with my dad to dig the hole and pour the cement and make sure that the goal was just right so that everything was straight. And I remember raising it to 10 feet, lowering it every now and then so that even at my small stature I could dunk and feel a little bit of power. But I also remember very vividly playing basketball with my dad a lot. He loved to play with me. We would play hour on end. It didn't matter the weather. My mom would have to call us in for dinner. And our games would at times get a little bit physical. Because if for no other reason, my dad wanted to teach me the lesson that the world's never going to give you anything. You have to earn it no matter what the struggle may be. And so he was never, ever going to let me win a game of basketball. I had to earn it. I'll never forget the first time when I drove past him for that final point, put it up against the backboard, it went in, and I was elated. At last, I had overcome and beaten my dad in basketball. And I looked back at him, ready to just shove it in his face and gloat as much as I could. And I remember him just standing there with this calm and confident smile on his face. He looked at me and said, "Good game," and shook my hand. A struggle between father and son, a blessing in a way given, and in some ways, an identity claimed. Jacob is one of my favorite characters in all the scriptures. If for no other reason, it's because he's a fighter. He refuses to simply accept things as they are. Now, maybe a little bit of that is in his name. After all, names, especially in the Old Testament, meant something very important. Just look at his father, Isaac. You remember the story. Abraham and Sarah are told that they're going to have a child, and they're so old they can't even believe it. And Sarah, when she hears the news, she does what? She laughs. And so they call him Yitzhak, which means laughter. When Moses has the burning bush experience and asks God's own name, we get the name Yahweh, which is meant to be said in the Jewish traditions almost as if it is the very breath and spirit of God, and it simply means I am. Jacob, Yaakov, no different. When he was born, he was the second among twins. That story was shared already with our children this morning. It's one that should be very familiar to all of us. And if you remember the story, you remember that when Esau, the older son, is born, Jacob is grasping at his heels, either to try to pull him back or almost as if to say, you are not going to beat me at this. I will struggle with you. We also know the rest of the story, the struggle of these two brothers. A younger brother whose mother convinces him to steal the birthright of the older. Jacob, the trickster, the one who grabs by the heel, the usurper, is also the one who later becomes named Israel, wrestler with God, one who comes up against God and against humans and prevails. Sometimes it's that struggle that's necessary, that struggle between us and individuals that we know and love that really makes the relationship in a way. Old Testament scholar Corrine Carvalho says that this is not the Sunday where we think about simple and submissive servanthood when it comes to faith. That's an important image. And there are some people who come to the faith so naturally that they simply submit to it. And that's the way that they spend their whole lives. But not all of us. This is a demanding disciple type Sunday here. When we get Jacob, this is the one where we remember all of those out there who have the audacity to hold on to God and to struggle with the faith and demand that God bless them, knowing that God will help all things come out right. My mother was an 8th grade math teacher. She was one of the most inspiring and wonderful people, not only because she was my mother, but if for no other reason, because of the way that she spent her vocation. I remember very vividly when she would come home and talk about the students that she was dealing with. Yes, there were always the stars, but those were quite often not the stories that were shared around the dinner table. It's always the ones that you struggle with. My mother was one of those teachers that she tried to retire multiple times, but they kept finding ways to bring her back in on a part-time basis. And they'd always end up giving her the worst students, the worst math students, the ones that nobody else wanted. And yet at the end of the year, her class was almost always one of the ones with the highest test scores. It wasn't just that she found a way to help them understand the material. It was because of the relationship that she was able to make with them. I remember hearing stories about students who would come back in their 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, and senior years about to go off to college. Students whose home lives were wrecked and torn apart. They had disorders of one kind or another. They struggled to understand the ways that she was trying to teach them. They had behavior problems in the classroom, and everybody else had sort of just rejected them, but not Miss King. No, she found a way to look at that student and see their potential and struggle with them, and she let them know very early on that this was not going to be something that they could simply walk away from. And those were her favorite stories. The stories of the students who had come up against the challenges of life and prevailed. Those are the ones that God works through as well, I think. It's not simply that faith can just be accepted, but it has to be struggled with. God desires, in some ways, struggle from us that helps to shape us and helps to shape how we understand things and helps to shape all of who we are. Just look at the stories throughout the Bible. Not just Jacob's story as it happens today, but even Abraham started out at first. He was called, and yes, he's honored because he went faithfully, but he questioned whether or not God would come through on the promise and tried to take matters into his own hands. What about Moses, who was called to go back to Egypt, to that place where he was wanted for murder, where he thought the people would never accept him, where he thought that the people would never be able to understand him because he wasn't confident in his ability to speak a word of truth and liberation from God. What about David, the one who cried out, "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever?" What about the story of Job? We use him as the great example of patient faith, one who can endure anything. But even when it got so hard, even Job cried out and questioned and wrestled about Mary? Mary, the mother of Jesus, who, yes, we know that in the story that we read in Luke 2, as we get towards Advent and we hear of the great Annunciation, yes, she says, "Let it be with me as you have said," but she must have known what that struggle was going to bring, what that life of raising the Son of God must be, and to agonize watching him on the cross, not knowing if he was living through what God wanted him to because it was her son. Or what about Mary Magdalene? The one who heard the good news, saw the Lord face to face after the resurrection, and went back to the men who believed she had lost her mind. But she told them anyway, "He is risen." It's those who struggle with God and with humans. Those are the ones who come to be the most inspiring examples of the faith for me. We think of the calling of C.S. Lewis, a more modern example than obviously what we have in the Bible. As he writes about his conversion experience, if you remember his story, yes, he ended up being one of the greatest apologists for the faith of the 20th century, but he started out questioning everything, denying everything. And he describes his experience of coming to understand God as being almost in the middle of the night at his desk, and finally the one that he had tried to avoid meeting most of all took hold of him. Or even Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, the great saint. After she passed away, some of her prayer journals and other journals were shared, and even she, one who was willing to go where most other people refused to go, to be with those that many people would have refused to be with because of her faith in Christ her Lord, even she had experiences of absence. She wrote very vividly about feeling lonely, as if God wasn't even there. Faith that is not struggled with, faith that is not tested, it's not really faith at all, I don't believe. If it doesn't make us uncomfortable, if it doesn't lead us to a place where we have to struggle, or if we're not willing to struggle with it, how could we possibly take hold of it and own it as our own? Sometimes the testing comes from God, as it did with Jacob, and it was crucial. He was on the wrong path. He was acting almost like a coward here. He had gone back and had an encounter with his brother, and he was going to come back to a place of reconciliation with him, sure, but he also feared what his brother would do. He thought his brother still had a bloodthirst for him. So he divides everything up. Sends his wives and his maids and his children and his possessions in different places so that if Esau attacks one of them, he can't possibly get them all. And then he stays by the river by himself. It feels almost like a coward's move, doesn't it? And yet it's at that place, in that moment, where God grabs hold of Jacob and will not let him go. But Jacob as well grab hold back and will not let God go. And in that struggle, he becomes the one for whom all of God's chosen people are named. It's not the people of Abraham, descendants maybe, but not people. It's not the people of Moses, it's the people of Israel. It's the God wrestlers, the one who struggles with God. Those were the ones who got the name and the blessing. Barbara Brown Taylor says that sometimes it feels like this struggle, you don't know if it's for good or for bad. In her book, Learning to Walk in the Darkness, she describes a time where she and her husband were walking upon the beach, and they come up against this loggerhead turtle that had come up to the beach to lay its eggs. And apparently in the nighttime it had looked and seen a light that it thought was a moon, and it had gone the wrong way away from the water. And they saw it in the day, and it was clearly tired and thirsty and struggling. It had turned over on its back, was struggling to get over, and it was so large that there was no way that they could possibly turn it over themselves. So they called one of the people that was out there, a ranger of sorts, and he came upon with a vehicle and a chain and had to drag the turtle back to a place where it could get into the water and get to safety. And she said that sometimes this struggle, you don't know if it's killing you or saving you right in the middle of it. The struggle of the faith is a lifetime struggle. A struggle with God and a struggle with people. A struggle with understanding the ways of this world according to the ways and the teachings and lessons of God. And we must struggle with it. We must wrestle with God. Otherwise, how will we get through? Frederick Buechner speaks of this moment in stark terms to me. He says, not only was God the opponent of Jacob, not only was God the one that he was wrestling with, but at this moment, God was the enemy. Because God was going to bless Jacob with everything, but he demanded everything if he was going to give it. He demanded his life, he demanded his path, he demanded his will, he demanded his treasures, he demanded everything. And the question Buechner asks is, are we going to wrestle enough to where we will come to a place where we will be willing to give everything as well? There are those out there who might believe that the word Christian is shallow, that it means one who is unthinking, one who accepts the crazy things of faith blindly, or one who doesn't worry about what happens outside the walls of the church. They simply gather on Sunday morning for their little social club, where they're too wrapped up in people who will tell them one thing and say that it's Christian, and they won't question it. They will simply believe it. But I think this day is a reminder that true faith comes when we wrestle, when we take everything that we think we know and we question it. We take all of the things that we have been taught about God and the ways of this world, and we hold them up against one another and we test them. It's a very Baptist way of being in the world. A way that understands the priesthood of all believers. A way that says that we each are responsible individually to struggle with the text and with God and allow God's Spirit to take shape in us so that we can then turn around and shape the world. It's a struggle that leads us into the baptismal waters, where we should not only tell those who enter that we baptize them, our brother and our sister, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, but we are giving them a new identity. We are baptizing them as a God wrestler among us, one who wrestles with the faith, and if God is in fact in that wrestling, then we will prevail. It is a struggle we must teach our children. It is a struggle we must deal with every day as we come to the text and as we hold the newspaper or our phones as we're reading the news in our hand, as we make sense of this world. It requires that we do all of these things. It's how we own our faith. I had a professor in seminary. We were taking a class called Spiritual Formation, and he seemed to like to poke and prod the students a little bit. Because the reality is, many of us think we're going into seminary and we're just going to learn a little bit more about the Bible, we're going to learn the techniques of the ministry, and we're going to go out. And in reality, we come out with more questions than we ever had answers to begin with, and sometimes it's the professor's job to poke and prod and twist and question and make you think. It was often in these classes where he would take something that a student would say that very clearly they had never really questioned, they had never thought about, they had never wrestled with. And he would remind us that faith is not simply, as he said, what mama and them gave you. You have to own it. You have to wrestle with it. It has to become yours. And only by wrestling with God will you be shaped and given the true identity as a follower and a disciple that God desires all of God's people to have. Amen.